The year was 1958, and a United States Air Force base in Seoul, South Korea, was not a place where legends were made quietly. They were made in the dirt, under fluorescent light, in rooms that smelled of canvas and sweat, in front of men who had earned the right to watch. Carlos Ray Norris was 22 years old. He weighed 163 pounds. He was not the largest man in the building. He was not the loudest. He was not, by any measurement visible to the eye, the most dangerous. He was sitting in the third row of bleachers, in a plain grey T-shirt, watching a Tang Soo Do demonstration with the specific stillness of a man who has already made peace with whatever was about to happen. The instructor at the front of the room was Master Han Il-sung. 41 years old, 30 years of training in his body, a man who had broken 6 boards with a single turning kick the week before and had been photographed doing it. 12 black belts lined the perimeter. 114 airmen filled the seats. Nobody in that gymnasium knew they were about to watch the first scene of what would become a 40-year legend. In the next 15 encounters, documented across 11 countries, 16 decades of testimony, and 3 different martial arts disciplines, the man sitting in that grey shirt would demonstrate something that no training manual has ever found a way to put cleanly into words. What happened in those rooms was not violence, it was instruction. The world simply had not yet registered what was being taught. If you want to know what was said in those 15 rooms, what was thrown, what was pulled, what was spoken quietly into the ear of every man who asked for a reckoning, stay with this. Every second of it is worth the patience. The first scene began the way they all began, without announcement. Master Han had called for a volunteer from the visiting airmen. The offer was courteous. The invitation was respectful. What Han did not know, and had no mechanism to know, was that the young man who stood up from the third row had been training quietly in the corner of that base for 19 months, arriving before dawn, leaving after dark, never discussing what he was building inside himself. He walked to the center of the mat in his street shoes. He did not bow with performance. He bowed with economy. Han recognized the stance before the bow was finished. He widened his eyes by a fraction of a centimeter. That fraction was the first concession of the evening. The exchange lasted 11 seconds. In the first 3, Han measured the distance between them with a front kick, designed to establish respect and range. Norris did not block it. He did not retreat from it. He redirected it with his left forearm at an angle of 47 degrees and stepped inside the gap that the kick had briefly opened. In the next 2 seconds, he controlled the wrist, neutralized the follow-up elbow, and stood with his chest 4 inches from Han's chest, close enough that a strike was no longer physically possible for either man. He held that position for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stepped back. Then he bowed again. A distance lesson, plainly delivered. A fight, in its truest form, is not 2 bodies colliding. It is a conversation about proximity. Who controls it? Who surrenders it? Who understands it well enough to make it irrelevant? In 11 seconds on that Seoul gymnasium floor, Norris had stated his position in that conversation clearly and without hostility. Han bowed back. Then he said, in English that was careful and precise, "Come back tomorrow." Norris said, "Yes, sir." Those were the only words exchanged. That was scene 1. If you are watching this and you have not yet subscribed, do it now. What comes next? The 12 scenes that followed that gymnasium, the 2 that preceded it in ways nobody documented until 3 decades later, those are the reason this channel exists. Subscribe and tell us below where in the world you are watching from. Scene 2 arrived 3 years later in a San Jose, California dojo that belonged to a man named Bruce Lee. He was 22 years old to Norris's 27. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall and 131 pounds, without the kind of mass that typically signals danger to the untrained eye. 7 practitioners were seated along the wall when Norris arrived for what had been described as a friendly exchange of technique. Lee was standing barefoot on a hardwood floor, finishing a form that Norris recognized from Wing Chun, but altered, compressed, rebuilt for a speed threshold that traditional Wing Chun had not been designed to reach. Norris watched for 40 seconds without speaking. Then Lee turned around. What happened in the next 31 minutes was not a fight. It was a negotiation of philosophies. They moved together for half an hour in a language that has no adequate written equivalent. What the 7 witnesses recorded afterward, in journals and in letters, and in one case in a magazine interview that would not be published for 11 years, was that neither man could be said to have lost. One of the witnesses, a judo competitor named Richard Bustillo, who would go on to train dozens of professional fighters, sat with his hands flat on his knees for the full 31 minutes and did not say a word. Afterward he said, "I watched 2 men explain something to each other that I did not have the vocabulary to understand." Lee said something to Norris at the door as they finished. It was quiet enough that none of the 7 witnesses could reconstruct the full sentence. Bustillo heard the last 4 words. He repeated them once in that magazine interview 11 years later. The 4 words were, "You already know this." Scene 3 was a film set. Warner Brothers lot, stage 12. April of 1972. The director had hired a stuntman, a former collegiate wrestler from Ohio, 6 feet 2 inches, 227 pounds, 8 years younger than Norris, to choreograph a fight sequence for a scene that required 47 seconds of screen time. The stuntman had suggested, in the specific way that suggestions become professional provocations, that the sequence would look more authentic if the choreography reflected what would actually happen if the 2 men were not performing. He meant it as a question about ability. Norris took off his jacket. He folded it once. He set it on a production case near the left wall. The boom operator, a man named Vincent Quarry, who had worked 73 film productions in 9 years, said that he set his equipment down at that exact moment without knowing why. His hands simply moved on their own, and the equipment was on the floor, and his eyes were on the center of stage 12. The sequence that followed consumed 4 seconds of real time and 47 seconds of screen time, which is a different kind of measurement entirely. In the first second, Norris established a stance so relaxed that the stuntman visibly recalibrated his threat assessment downward. That recalibration was the mistake. In the second second, the stuntman committed to a takedown that was technically sound and practically irrelevant, because Norris was no longer in the position the stuntman had aimed at. In the third second, the stuntman was on the floor. In the fourth second, Norris was standing above him with one hand extended. He did not stretch afterward. He did not acknowledge the room. He picked up his jacket from the production case, folded it over his left arm, and walked back to his mark. Quarry picked up his equipment. The director called for a 10-minute break in a voice that suggested he needed considerably longer than 10 minutes. The stuntman took the hand. That was his fork in the road, and he chose correctly. He stood up. He said one thing to Norris quietly that nobody else on stage 12 was close enough to hear. Norris nodded once. They choreographed the scene. It ran for 47 seconds on screen. Critics called it one of the most believable fight sequences of the year. Scenes 4 through 14 covered 11 countries over 3 decades. There was a London gym in 1974 where a kickboxing champion named Gerald Bremner, who had won 31 consecutive professional bouts over 7 years, issued a challenge in front of 63 of his own students that was specific and public and carried the particular energy of a man who has never yet been wrong about himself. The challenge lasted, in real time, 9 seconds. The finishing technique was a spinning back kick arrested 4 inches from Bremner's left temple, not 1 inch, not 6, but 4, because the precision was the message. Bremner stood at his fork in the road for a long moment. Then he turned to his 63 students and told them, in a voice that did not waver, to observe closely what they had just seen, because they would not see it again in this gymnasium, and likely not anywhere else. That was the apology. It required no additional words. There was a Rome martial arts festival in 1978 where Norris sat in the audience for 2 hours while a demonstration escalated. In the specific way that demonstrations in that era were inclined to escalate into something that required a response. His response lasted 6 seconds. The recognition wave moved through the room row by row, from the front to the back, the way a current moves across water when something heavy has been dropped near the center. There was a Tokyo dojo in 1982 that had produced 4 national champions and did not receive visitors from outside Japan who were expected to remain visitors for very long. Norris remained a visitor for exactly 37 seconds. He was offered tea afterward. He accepted it. There was a television stage in Burbank in 1985, a closed-door session in Oslo in 1988, a training facility in Manila in 1991, and 7 other rooms in 7 other cities, where the same equation was demonstrated with the same unhurried precision. Someone who was genuinely skilled, genuinely credentialed, and genuinely certain made a public decision that required a public answer, and the answer arrived quietly and without remainder. The pattern across all 14 scenes was this. The finishing strike was never delivered at full power. The hand was always extended. The private sentence was always spoken at a volume that excluded the room, and the man who had issued the challenge was always left standing, diminished by nothing except his own prior certainty, and offered, in the specific silence that followed, the opportunity to revise it. Scene 15 was not a fight. It was a gymnasium in Thousand Oaks, California. The year was 2003. Norris was 63 years old. A group of 14 teenagers, none of them older than 16, had been brought to the facility by a youth outreach program he had founded himself. He stood in the center of the floor for 2 hours. He did not throw a single technique for the first hour and 40 minutes. He talked about distance. He talked about patience. He talked about what it means to stand in a room with someone who wants to harm you and to decide, before a single movement is made, that the encounter will end without harm to anyone in it. He said this was a skill. He said it was learnable. He said it was, in fact, the only skill that had ever mattered in any of the 14 rooms that had preceded this one. One of the 14 teenagers asked him whether he had ever been afraid. He considered the question for a moment, with the specific seriousness that questions from 16-year-olds deserve when they are actually serious questions. Then he said, "Every time." The teenager asked what he did with the fear. Norris said, "The same thing you do with anything that arrives before you are ready for it. You make room for it. And then you work." He picked up his jacket from the bench where he had set it. He folded it once. He walked out of the gymnasium without looking back. What those 15 rooms have in common is not Chuck Norris. Every room had different walls, different witnesses, different languages spoken in the corridors outside. What they have in common is the moment when the man in the plain clothes folded his jacket, set it down and walked to the center of something that had already been decided. The deciding was never done in the room. It was done in the years before the room. In every dawn session and every hour of practice that no audience watched and no camera recorded, what the room saw was only the evidence. The story a man carries in his body and the story he tells about himself are, eventually, the same story. The 15 rooms were simply where the telling happened. Next week, we go into the room that nobody was supposed to talk about. A closed-door session between Chuck Norris and a man whose name you will recognize immediately. in a city that neither of them has ever publicly confirmed being in at the same time. The witnesses signed nothing. The story survived anyway. Be here for it.